My name is Edith Holloway. I am 74 years old, and my life's work has been the patient and loving excavation of ghosts. I am a genealogist, not a professional one, not in the sense of a paid-for service, but a lifelong, passionate, and deeply committed family historian. My world is one of dusty courthouse basements, of the faint, spidery script on 100-year-old census records, of the thrilling, almost sacred moment when a forgotten name on a passenger manifest clicks into place, and a whole branch of your family tree, once lost to the mists of time, suddenly bursts back into leaf. I believe that a family is not just a collection of living people. It is a story. A long, complex, and often difficult story written over centuries. And my role, the role I chose for myself, was to be its librarian, its archivist, its guardian. My late husband, Thomas, a man with a quiet love for history, understood this. Our home was not a house. It was an archive. Every wall was lined with books. Every closet held carefully labeled boxes of old photographs, of letters tied with faded silk ribbons, of the small, precious, and often fragile artifacts of our ancestors' lives. We were the custodians of the Holloway family story, a story that stretched back to the first settlers of this very town. Our only son, Robert, grew up in this world of history, but he never truly saw it. He saw the dust. He saw the clutter. He saw the past, not as a living foundation upon which his own life was built, but as a series of old, irrelevant, and slightly embarrassing stories. He was a man in a desperate hurry to arrive at the future, and he had no patience for the slow, winding road of the past. He married Vanessa, a woman who is the physical embodiment of the unarchived life. She is beautiful, ambitious, and her entire existence is a carefully curated and utterly ahistorical performance of modern, upper-middle-class perfection. Her world is one of new furniture, of minimalist aesthetics, of a life scrubbed clean of the messy, inconvenient, and deeply defining fingerprints of the past. She saw my beloved archive of family history not as a treasure, but as a hoard, a collection of junk that stood in the way of progress. My great sacrifice, the long, slow, and almost imperceptible process of allowing my own story to be archived away, began after Thomas died. The house, our beautiful story-filled archive, became too quiet, too empty, and Robert and Vanessa, who were living in a small city apartment, their lives a constant, stressful struggle to maintain the facade of a success they had not yet achieved, saw their opportunity. "It's too much house for you, Mom," Robert had said, his voice a perfect, soothing balm of loving, sonly concern. "All this space, all this stuff. The upkeep must be a terrible burden for you. We should sell it." Vanessa had chimed in, her voice as bright and as sharp as a newly minted coin. We could all find a new, modern, and much more manageable place. Together. And so, I did it. For them. For the dream of a together that I so desperately craved in my loneliness. I sold the house. I sold our archive. I sold the physical embodiment of my entire life's work, my entire family's history. The proceeds were substantial. We did not, of course, find a new place together. They found a magnificent, sprawling, and breathtakingly expensive new house for themselves, in a gated community, in the city's most exclusive suburb. A house in a neighborhood with a good school district, a house that would be a perfect stage for their own, newly minted, family story. And I, with a small fraction of the proceeds they had allowed me to keep, moved into a small, one-bedroom and utterly soulless rental apartment across town. My sacrifice was almost total. I had liquidated my past to finance their present. I had traded my role as the guardian of our family's history for a new, and much diminished, one, the doting and financially useful grandmother. I did it because I believed that family was the most important story of all, a story that required compromise, that required sacrifice. I did not realize that they were in the process of writing a new edition of that story, one in which my own character was about to be unceremoniously and permanently written out. My new life, in my small anonymous apartment, was a life of waiting. Waiting for the phone to ring. Waiting for an invitation. Waiting to be included in the new, shiny, and exclusive story of the Robert Holloway family. The invitations, when they came, were rare and always on their terms. I was invited to my grandchildren's birthday parties, where I was expected to provide a lavish gift and then to sit quietly in a corner, a quaint, historical artifact for Vanessa's new, wealthy friends to observe. I was invited to Thanksgiving, where I was tasked with bringing my famous and very time-consuming homemade pies, and then was seated at the children's table. I was not a guest. I was a service provider, a caterer with a genetic connection. But the one event that was sacred, the one story I still believed we were writing together, was Christmas. Christmas, in the Holloway family, had always been my domain. It was a tradition that stretched back generations, a beautiful, complex, and deeply meaningful ritual. It was not just a day, it was a season, a story that began on Christmas Eve with the reading of our great-great-grandfather's journal from his first winter in this country, and ended on Christmas Day with a magnificent dinner, every dish a recipe passed down through the generations. It was the one time of year that I was not just a doting grandmother. I was the matriarch, the storyteller, the guardian of the flame. This year, I had been preparing for weeks. I had spent hours in the city archives, finding a new, undiscovered story about the family to share. I had started baking the traditional Christmas cookies, the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon, a warm, hopeful ghost in my small, lonely apartment. I had bought the gifts, of course, gifts that were far too expensive for my new, modest budget. The text message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 5 days before Christmas Eve. I was in my kitchen, my hands covered in flour, a batch of sugar cookies cooling on the rack. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was from Robert. I wiped my hands on my apron, and I picked it up. My heart was full of a quiet, joyful anticipation. He was probably texting to confirm the time I should arrive on Christmas Eve. I opened the message, and I read the words. The simple, clean, and brutally efficient words that would, in the space of 10 seconds, take the entire, beautiful, 400-year-old story of my family and burn it to ash. The text read, "We, Mom, just wanted to let you know about Christmas this year. Vanessa and I have decided to start some of our own traditions, so we're going to keep it small, just the 4 of us. You won't be joining us. My wife prefers to keep Christmas to just our immediate family this year. You won't be joining us. Age. Just our immediate family. And INT." The words did not just enter my eyes. They entered my soul, like shards of ice. I stood there, in my small, warm, and cinnamon-scented kitchen, and a coldness so profound, so absolute, washed over me that I began to shiver. I read the text again, and again. My mind, the mind of a genealogist, a mind that understood the deep and sacred meaning of a family tree, snagged on that one, final, and utterly devastating phrase. Immediate family. Idri, and Al, Afanda, Anari. He had not just uninvited me from a holiday. He had, with the casual, careless cruelty of a god, redrawn the very boundaries of our family. And he had placed me, his mother, the woman who had given him life, the woman who was the living, breathing trunk of his own family tree, on the outside. I was no longer immediate. I was ancillary, a distant, and apparently disposable, relative. The cookies on the rack, the ones I had baked for my grandchildren, suddenly looked like pale, pathetic, and deeply foolish little ghosts. The stories I had prepared, the history I had so carefully preserved, was a language no one wanted to hear anymore. The humiliation was not in the exclusion itself. It was in the medium. A text message. He had not had the courage to tell me to my face, to hear the sound of my heart breaking over the phone. He had delivered the most profound and cruel blow of my life in a bloodless, sterile, and utterly cowardly burst of blue and white pixels. In that moment, the loving, sacrificial, and endlessly hopeful mother died. The woman who had sold her own history to finance their future was gone. And in her place, a new woman was born. A woman I did not know. She was not a mother. She was not a victim. She was a genealogist, a historian, a woman who had just been reminded that some family lines, some stories, are not worth preserving, and that some, which have been long forgotten, are worth unearthing. And she knew, with the cold, clear, and absolute certainty of a scholar who has just discovered a new, and much more interesting, primary source document, that the official Holloway family history was about to be radically and permanently revised. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, the phone still glowing in my hand, the smell of gingerbread and betrayal thick in the air. The initial searing pain of the wound began to cool, to harden, to transform. A lifetime of carefully managed, genteel emotions receded, and in its place rose something I had not felt in decades. It was the cold, thrilling, and utterly clarifying anger of the scholar, whose life's work has just been defaced by a vandal. They had not just uninvited me from a dinner. They had, with the casual, ignorant arrogance of the truly stupid, tried to vandalize a story that was 400 years in the making. They had tried to erase the archives. They redefined the very meaning of the word family, a word whose etymology I had traced back to its Latin roots, a word whose every beautiful and complex and sacred connotation they had just spat upon. The loving mother, the doting and endlessly forgiving grandmother was gone. She had been exiled by a text message. In her place stood Edith Holloway, the genealogist. And the genealogist, I discovered, was a woman of formidable and deeply pedantic fury. My mind, the mind trained to see the long, sprawling, and interconnected patterns of history, began to work. They wanted to redefine immediate family. Find out why. I would accept their new definition. And then I would present them with a much older, much more powerful, and legally binding one. My secret weapon was not a sudden inheritance or a hidden bank account. It was, as it had always been, my work, my archive, the very history they had disdained. Years ago, while I was in the process of archiving the oldest of the Holloway family papers, the ones from the 17th century, I had found a document. It was a beautiful and deeply strange thing, written on thick, vellum-like paper, the ink a faded, rusty brown, the script a beautiful, almost unreadable copperplate. It was the original land grant for the 500-acre parcel of land that our town was eventually built upon, the land that had been the source of the Holloway family's original, and now long since diversified, fortune. And attached to it was a trust. It was a peculiar, almost feudal document, drafted by a deeply religious and slightly eccentric ancestor. It placed the core of the Holloway land holdings, the parcel where my son's new, magnificent, and gated community house now stood, into a perpetual trust to be passed down through the generations. But it was a trust with a condition, a strange and deeply moral continuity clause. The clause, written in the beautiful and deeply serious language of the 17th century, stipulated that the land was to be held by that branch of my lineage which doth, in its generation, best exemplify the virtues of familial piety, the honoring of elders, and the sacred duty of carrying forth our shared history. And then, the final and most devastating line, the final and sole arbiter of this piety, it read, shall be in each generation the eldest living, and of sound mind, direct descendant of my own blood. That was me. I was the eldest living, and of sound mind, direct descendant. I was the final and sole arbiter. At the time, I had seen the document as a charming historical curiosity, a testament to my ancestors' strange puritanical mind. My lawyer had agreed, calling it antiquated and likely unenforceable. But I was a historian. I knew that the past is never truly dead, and I had, out of a genealogist's obsessive respect for the primary source, insisted on having the trust's legal standing quietly reaffirmed when we had sold the old house. It had been a simple and inexpensive legal maneuver, a small act of historical preservation. My son Robert had signed the papers without reading them, bored and impatient with his mother's fussy, historical hobbies. He had no idea what he had signed. He had no idea that he did not, in fact, own his beautiful new house. He was merely the current and provisional beneficiary of a 400-year-old moral contract. A contract whose terms he had just, in a single 10-word text message, spectacularly and irrevocably breached. My decision was not a decision. It was a conclusion. A logical and deeply satisfying deduction based on the available evidence. My son, by excluding me, by severing the sacred line of familial piety, had just, by the very definition of our family's oldest and most sacred text, written himself out of the will. He had chosen his immediate family. I was now simply honoring his choice and enforcing the terms of the contract. But a good genealogist never relies on a single source. I needed to find a new heir, a new and more worthy branch of the family tree. And I knew where to look. My own, decades-long, research had unearthed a forgotten branch of the Holloway family, descendants of a second son from the 18th century, who had been a quiet, scholarly abolitionist, a man who had been disowned by his slave-owning family, and had moved west. I had traced his line through dusty census records and forgotten church registries all the way to the present day. The current descendant was a man named Dr. Thomas Holloway, a history professor at a small university in California, a man I had exchanged a few tentative and deeply exciting emails with a few years ago, a man who, like me, was a passionate and dedicated keeper of the record. The plan formed a beautiful, multi-generational, and perfectly researched piece of historical and legal art dadi. I would not just disinherit my son. I would replace him. I would graft a new, healthier, and more deserving branch onto the dying trunk of our family tree. I would not just be the guardian of our family's past. I would be the architect of its future. My war was not a war of emotion. It was a war of paperwork. A quiet and deeply satisfying campaign of legal and historical correspondence. My first act on the Monday morning before Christmas was not to weep into my teacup. It was to call my lawyer. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice crisp, clear, and full of a purpose he had not heard in years. "Do you recall the Holloway Perpetual Trust? The one we reaffirmed 3 years ago?" "Vaguely, Edith," he said. "The charming but legally questionable one with all the familial piety nonsense?" "It is no longer nonsense, Mr. Abernathy," I said. "It is now the central and legally binding document in the restructuring of my family's estate. A breach of contract has occurred, a profound one. I am invoking my right as the sole arbiter. We are redirecting the trust." My second act was an email, a long, detailed, and deeply personal email, to Dr. Thomas Holloway in California. I did not mention the money. I did not mention the house. I spoke to him as one historian to another. I told him the story of our shared ancestor, the abolitionist. I told him of the ancient trust and of its strange moral clause. And I told him of the current crisis in our family, of a branch that had become so disconnected from its own history, from its own roots, that it was beginning to wither and die. And then I asked him a simple question. "Would you," I wrote, "be interested in helping me to preserve our shared family story?" His reply came the next morning. It was a beautiful, intelligent, and deeply moving email. The email of a man who, like me, understood that history is not just a collection of names and dates, but a sacred, living thing. He too had been trying to piece together the story of his own lost family. He would, he said, be honored to help in any way he could. The final act was the preparation of the documents. Mr. Abernathy, now fully engaged and deeply fascinated by this strange, archaic, and beautiful piece of legal machinery, drew up the papers. It was a formal, legal declaration. As the sole arbiter of the Holloway Perpetual Trust, I, Edith Holloway, had determined that my son, Robert Holloway, had failed to meet the conditions of the continuity clause, and I was therefore, as was my right, redirecting the trust's primary asset, the house and the land upon which it stood, to the next most deserving heir in the direct, traceable bloodline, Dr. Thomas Holloway of California. The documents were notarized, sealed, and ready, but I did not send them. Not yet. The timing, as in any good story, was everything. I spent Christmas Eve alone. I did not cry. I sat in my small, quiet apartment, and I read the letters of my ancestors. I drank a small glass of sherry, and I toasted the brave, principled, and long-dead men and women who had given me not just my name, but my purpose. I spent Christmas Day alone. I ate a simple, solitary meal, and I imagined the scene at my son's house. The beautiful, perfect, and utterly fraudulent performance of their immediate family Christmas. The opening of the lavish, expensive gifts. The feasting. The laughter. The quiet, unspoken, and deeply satisfying relief at my own blessed absence. I waited until the day after Christmas, the 26th, a day of quiet, post-holiday exhaustion. The day the garbage is put out, and the decorations begin to look a little sad. The perfect day for a quiet and deeply anticlimactic apocalypse. I did not send the documents by a scary-looking process server. That was not my style. I sent them by a standard, bonded courier. A quiet, anonymous man in a neat brown uniform. The package was addressed to my son, Robert. Inside was a single, leather-bound folder, and in that folder was the legal declaration, a copy of the original trust, a detailed and beautifully written genealogical chart showing the direct line from our 17th century ancestor to Dr. Thomas Holloway, and a polite and deeply formal cover letter. The letter was my masterpiece. It was not the letter of a heartbroken mother. It was the letter of a librarian, a historian, an archivist, correcting a catastrophic error in the record. Dear Robert, it began, I am writing to you in my official capacity as the arbiter of the Holloway Perpetual Trust. It has come to my attention that your branch of the family no longer meets the foundational requirements of the trust, specifically the clause regarding familial piety. Therefore, I have been forced to make a small, archival correction. Please find the enclosed documentation detailing the transfer of the trust's assets to a more historically appropriate beneficiary. The new beneficiary has graciously allowed you a period of 30 days to vacate the premises. I do wish you and your immediate family all the best in your future endeavors. The trap was not a loud, angry, screaming thing. It was a quiet, paper-filled, and utterly, devastatingly, historically accurate thing. And it had just been delivered to his front door. The phone call came, as I knew it would, on the evening of the 26th. I was in my small, quiet apartment, cataloging a new collection of old family photographs I had just had digitized. The caller ID flashed with Robert's name. I let it ring for a long, satisfying moment, a small private symphony of his dawning panic. Then, I answered, my voice calm, neutral, and as quiet as a library reading room. Hello? Mother, he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched, incredulous sound of pure, unadulterated terror. What is this? What have you done? This letter. It's a joke, right? This is some kind of sick, twisted, senile joke. I assure you, Robert, I said, my voice as precise and as cool as a card catalog entry. I have never been less senile in my entire life. And I do not joke about primary source documents. It is, as the letter clearly states, a simple and long overdue archival correction. Archival correction? He screamed. You're throwing us out of our own house. You're giving it to some stranger. A history professor in California. He is not a stranger, Robert, I corrected him gently. He is your fourth cousin, 3 times removed. And he, unlike you, has demonstrated a profound and deeply admirable commitment to the preservation of our shared family history. He, unlike you, has met the terms of the contract. I could hear Vanessa in the background, her voice a rising, hysterical wail. This isn't legal. We'll sue you. We'll prove you're incompetent. We'll tell everyone you've lost your mind, will you? I asked, a genuine, academic curiosity in my voice. On what grounds? The very document that gives you a home is the same one that gives me the soul, an absolute authority to take it away. You signed it yourself. As for my mind, I've just successfully executed a flawless, multi-generational, and legally complex transfer of a perpetual trust. I suspect any judge in this state would find that to be the very definition of competence. The collapse of their world was not a loud, dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, internal, and deeply textual implosion. They were not just losing a house. They were losing their story. The entire, beautiful, and utterly fraudulent narrative of their lives, the successful young couple in the magnificent home, was being erased, not by a market crash, not by a catastrophic illness, but by a 400-year-old piece of paper and a quiet, 74-year-old librarian. They had no recourse. Their anger, their threats, their tears, they were all useless. They were trying to argue with a footnote. They were trying to emotionally blackmail a historical fact. And the fact was, they did not own their own lives. They had been living on a loan from a history they had never respected, and the loan had just been called in. They tried to fight it, of course. They hired a lawyer, a man who, after reviewing the trust documents quietly and firmly, advised them to surrender. The trust, he informed them, was a legal work of art, a beautiful and utterly unbreakable fortress. And so, they were forced to do the one thing they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. They were forced to face the real, unsubsidized, and deeply inconvenient consequences of their own actions. My old life ended that Christmas in a silent, lonely, but deeply satisfying act of historical revisionism. My new life began a month later with a handshake. They moved out. I did not go to the house to watch. I